this morning, a book fell off my bookshelf, and it's Jimi Hendrix. Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky, and it's the life story of Jimi Hendrix, told by someone else. But I remember picking up that book when I was, I think, a sophomore in college, and I had started to listen to Jimi Hendrix, and I had never heard him. Like I grew up in the suburbs of Boston and Worcester, Mass. Before that, and really had almost no contact with Black people at all. I mean, I lived in kind of a very, you know, like just a white suburb. I don't know how else to call it. There was one Black family in our suburb. Steve Marshall, he was one of my best friends, actually. In middle school, we were really into music, and we went to our first concert together. We went and saw Styx at the Boston Garden. But yeah, so I ended up, not even discovering Black music, though, until college, and really it was all through Jimi Hendrix. I got into Hendrix pretty heavily. I would only listen to Jimi Hendrix for about a year. And I read this book about him, and it was talking about how he had gone to Chicago to look up some of his idols. People like Sonny Boy Williamson, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and how excited he was to get to meet his heroes. So I thought, wow, well, if it's good enough for Jimi Hendrix, I should check this stuff out. And, I was trying to figure out how to play Hendrix on the guitar. I'd played guitar since I was 16, but really hadn't made a whole lot of progress. And I couldn't play any of the Hendrix stuff. It was way too complicated. But once I started listening to blues, I tuned in on my college radio station, WBSU, Middletown, Connecticut, and just really got turned on to it. It seemed a little simpler musically to be able to figure out on the guitar. And that was my entree into like really a lifelong love affair with blues, and then soul music kind of after that, which kind of is kind of blues plus gospel equals soul. That's the way.
House in New Orleans, they call the rising sun. It's been a ruin of many orders. Me, oh Lord, the way I heard Dave do it, Dave Van Raa, I just thought it was just amazing, and it was different. The way the Animals, apparently, Bob Dylan stole Dave's version, and then the Animals stole their version, his version, and anyway, Dave's was just the one man doing it, and there was something about it that was just, and he was singing it from the woman's point of view, which I learned to write some of my songs when I wrote On the Road to Fairfax County. I wrote from the woman's point of view. I think it's important not to be so strict about that sort of thing, to open yourself up to interpreting songs. Dave's version of so many songs were just unlike anybody else's. It was like the essential version of it. And when I toured with Dave, lucky enough to tour with him, I was the sense of history was apparent to me, and he was so kind and accepting of the new generation that had gone beyond Bob's generation. All of a sudden, here was a whole new batch of kids, and he saw good things in us, and that was amazing to me. I was going, gee, he sees good things in us. That's a stamp of approval that I can get through the winter with that. Dave was instrumental in my development as an artist, I think. And my appreciation for the old things intensified, and I made it a duty to learn his things, and to it only took me 100 listenings of his version of that song to figure out the dulcimer version of it, because that's his chords. And I only have 3 strings, but this is his chords. And I would go through each one. I listened to it. Back to the first chord. This was big. Where do I go now? Back to this one. This was a hard one right here. Down. Right there. Here's a big one. Wow, when I finished that after 100 listenings, I was so pleased. I said, now I can start learning how to sing it.
When I was very young, I remember the Beatles. So they really got big when I was around 3 or 4. And they, colored a big chunk of my childhood. I didn't discover, I guess my brothers were listening to the Beatles. And then later, when I discovered pop radio, that was probably around age 11. Then I started getting into pop radio. And then a little later, like age 14, 15, my brother, who actually also taught me to play like basic guitar when I was around 10, he introduced me to Joni Mitchell, to her album Blue. And then that kind of changed everything, because I wasn't aware of, I don't know that I was aware, I certainly wasn't aware of her. And this was now like 1975, 1974. And I wasn't really aware of that whole world. And I became completely besotted and obsessed with Joni Mitchell. And I wanted to write like her and sing like her. And I was a teenager. So that's what you do when you're a teenager. You try to write and sing like your idol. And then I discovered like Joan Baez and Jackson Browne and James Taylor and all of that. But Joni Mitchell was the big influence. And then I guess it all came in sort of phases, because then when I was 22, just before I quit music, I ended up discovering, mostly through a boyfriend, Graham Parsons. And that was a whole other world that I wasn't aware of at all. That sort of country rock, now it would be called alt country. And I fell in love with that. So that's kind of the sequence of my influences. But first and foremost, absolutely Joni Mitchell, after the Beatles.
I always loved music, and I listened to a wide variety of it as a kid. We had a record player. We bought records. My sister took piano lessons. I studied slide trombone for 3 years. I listened to my mom's jazz records. My dad had Scottish dance music records, old fiddle tunes and Sir Harry Lauder stuff. It's a good old Scottish custom that has stood the test of time. It's a custom that's been carried out in every land and clime. Wherever Scotsmen gather, it's there the usual thing. Just afore we say goodnight, we'll fill our cups and sing. Just a wee duck and Doris, just a wee draft, that's all. Just a wee duck and Doris, afore we gang a war. There's a wee wifey waiting with a wee back and pen, and you can say it's a Brabant moonlight night, and you're all right if you can. Big hit in the First World War. My dad had the 78. I played it 10 million times as a kid. One really strong memory in my mind is that I was watching the Dorsey Brothers. You'd have to be pretty old to remember this. I was watching the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra had a weekly TV show on Saturday nights. And Tommy Dorsey played the trombone, and I was into the trombone. So I was watching it, and they brought out a new singer, Elvis Presley, for his first appearance on national TV. It was the first time anybody outside the South had ever seen him. And we were in Connecticut, so it was my first time. And I don't know why, but my whole family was watching, and we all got totally into Elvis. Everybody, even my dad, who by that time was in his mid-40s probably. And we went out and we bought a bunch of his 45s. My sister and I jitterbugged around the room dancing to his records. And I had a plastic guitar, and I would stand in my room and pretend I was Elvis and play with my thumb. I didn't know what to do with my left hand. I would just like do this with my thumb. And it had twine strings, like real string for strings. And this big thubby felt flat pick about this big around. And in fourth grade, I played Don't Be Cruel for my for Halloween for my classmates. So that was, I'm sure, a big influence. And then I got into rock and roll. I'm doing a lecture this week on Buddy Holly for my program. I loved Buddy Holly, had his greatest hits album, played it all the time. And then in the early 60s, I got really into Trini Lopez and Ray Charles. And I think that the attraction to me with Trini Lopez was that I liked folk songs, but a lot of the performances of them were kind of low energy for, a 12-year-old. And so I started listening to his versions of them, like If I Had a Hammer and I Like to Be in America. And I really liked them. And then I got really into Ray Charles for a while. And I still know every Ray Charles song you can imagine practically. I recently did a concert of Ray Charles songs with my band for the program I teach in. And then the Beatles came along, and I got into the British invasion very deep. And somewhere in about 1965 or so, I got a copy of Donovan's first album with Colors and Catch the Wind on it. And at that point, I borrowed a guitar, and I started just playing his songs. And those are the first songs that I ever learned. Yellow is the color of my true love's hair in the morning when we rise. In the morning when we rise. Well, I had to play it with my thumb. And it was the only song I knew. So I went to the beach with a bunch of friends one day. We all skipped school. We went to the beach. And I had this like $10 Sears Roebuck guitar with me. And I was playing it with my thumb. And this real pretty girl said to me, "Do you know how to play that guitar?" And I said, "Well, I know a song." So she said, "Great, play it." So I sang it. And by the time I finished it, there were like 4 or 5 of her friends all sitting around, all these nice young women. And they said, "Play something else." I said, "I don't know anything else." So they said, "Play it again." So I played it again. I ended up playing it like 25 times over and over again, the same song. And gradually everybody started singing along. We had like this little folk happening on a blanket. And at the end of the day, I had this incredible blister on my thumb from strumming the guitar. So I went home and I went to the music shop in town, and I got myself a thumb pick and a flat pick. And I bought a chord book, and I started figuring out how to play. I think as a writer that the people who've most influenced me are probably Dylan and Leonard Cohen and Paul Simon and Joni Mitchell. I think of them as the preeminent writers, at least to me, during the period of time in which I was kind of learning how to write songs.
Great music is really timeless. I mean, the Beatles are timeless. My daughter, who's now 18, is absolutely obsessed with the Beatles. Loves, loves, loves them. And what can be better than that? It doesn't get better.
Just a wee duck in Doris, just a wee draft, that's all. Just a wee duck in Doris, afore we gang a war. There's a wee wifey waiting with a wee